Thank you to the Pennsylvania Soybean Board for sponsoring our 2025 Crops Conference and Crops Days events. The Pennsylvania Soybean Board is responsible for the proper allocation of soybean checkoff dollars. This farmer-led board preserves and advances animal agriculture, identifies and promotes sustainable practices that provide ROI to farmers, promote biofuels through partnering opportunities, and drive new initiatives to increase the value and understanding of soy. Check them out online at pasoybean.org. Sponsors like the Pennsylvania Soybean Board allow us to host the annual Crops Conference and Crops Days events across the state. These events recap the 2024 PA crop production season, give insight to the latest agronomic research, products, and technology, and offer attendees pesticide recertification credits. If you would like to learn more about these events or to register, visit extension.psu.edu/crops-2025.
Welcome to another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Spellman, and I am joined here, as always, with the always lovely Justin Brackenridge. Justin, how are you doing today?
Good, Ryan. How are you doing this morning?
Justin, I am living the dream once again.
Good.
Yeah, always. I mean, we're kind of in our ever-continuing mission of bringing agronomy here full circle, right? I think before we logged on here, you mentioned agronomy is not just corn and beans, and that's kind of what we're working towards here, right?
Exploring creative avenues.
That's right.
We're taking an opportunity to look outside of that. Not anything wrong with corn and beans, so please don't write us a bunch of nasty emails. But there are a lot of other farmers that we interact with that don't just farm corn and beans and small grains, right? They're doing a lot of other things, and agriculture and agronomy have so many different things to talk about. So it's been fun the last while to kind of get into some of those different things. So today we are talking a lot down the lines of one of these different topics, and it's one that I'm very passionate about, right? Like Ryan, you kind of mentioned this a lot, and some of these others that Justin's more of the forage person, and because my background is more in forage and livestock, I think that it's something really worth talking about. And today we're going to talk about winter feeding and pasture management, right? And the reason I think this is important is because we see a lot of changes in our winters, especially here in Pennsylvania, right? It's not like that, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, maybe, where we got this cold freeze and it kind of got a deeper frost and we stayed a little frozen and we were able to winter more out. Where I'm sitting right now, it is pouring the rain down and it's 50 degrees. 3 days from now, it's supposed to be 16 degrees at night. And then after that, we're supposed to be 45 again, right? So that is much more what I see where I'm at. And that's not only hard on the livestock, but it's challenging on our fields and our agronomic things, right? So how do we put all this together and why do we care about it, Ryan?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like you said, we have here in central Pennsylvania, we just had a large snow event for December. I don't know, it depends what you consider large, but we had about 5 inches of snow here last week, and it's already raining again, right? So now we're talking about these muddy conditions. We're entering these wintertime conditions where, I mean, livestock are hard on that land, right? A lot of times when we're talking about forage production, we're talking about what we're doing in season. And this is, at this point, we're also talking about managing that land, preventing damage to that land, and also maybe managing our hay supply. There's a lot of things that go into this winter this winter feeding interval that we really need to consider. And I don't know in your area, Justin, I know we have some rough statistics about how much pasture land we're actually talking about, because I think it's always interesting when we talk about the Pennsylvania landscape. It's not like we're in the Midwest where we have these large sweeping, multi-thousand acre crop fields, and that's it, right? We have a really dynamic landscape, and in between all of the crop fields that I'm working on, there's pastures here, pastures there, whether they're being used for hay and a mix of feeding. There's just a lot of pasture land, and it's hard to get an exact point of how much is out there, but people have all different herd sides, all different types of pastures. It looks very dynamic. So these things really people need to nail down for themselves in their own area. So Justin, what does pasture land look in your area, and maybe what the numbers you extracted statewide as well?
Yeah, so I'm on the west, right? We get a little bit hilly over here, and so our corn, our beans, they kind of hit the river bottoms and stuff. But I would say the predominant, I don't have this statistic in front of me, but as we start to move up, right, it's we transition and again making this number up, but I would call it 80-20 going pasture to what we would call like arable or tillable land, right? And so we would see more of these 15, 20, 30 acre pastures with this like 3, 4 acre field that's flat enough and doesn't have a bunch of stone in it that if you really wanted, or years ago we were putting some corn or something like that in, that was the one where we picked all the rocks out of. We couldn't pick rocks out of everything, so we just picked one, and that became the arable field. Um, I did pull some numbers, and so they're saying 750,000 acres of pasture in Pennsylvania that support our livestock. And we threw this number around to back that up. We're saying 680,000 of corn. So, roughly 100,000 more. I was wrong in what I said earlier, but roughly 100,000 more pasture than corn. But even then, like we kind of feel like this might be low, right? It's how do we interpret
Mhm.
this? Take all of our statistics kind of with a grain of salt, right? Is this fallow ground that we see where we've got like old reclaimed mines or maybe things that used to be pasture that aren't? Um, but then we go the other direction and we have our hay fields that we could pasture after we're done with that. We have our corn ground or our beans or something that we've got a cover crop in. Our guest and I, and when he was doing extension work, actually wrote some fact sheet series on grazing livestock on cover crop, right? So like that's becoming a part of this, and we're not necessarily looking at those in the light of pasture ground, but it's still area that we're grazing livestock on that we should be thinking about and considering. So, it's a neat number, but I'm not sure that I would stake all of what we have on this 750,000 acres.
Yeah, definitely. I'd agree with that. Like I mentioned, in my area, I'd say that 10 to 20 acre field is pretty standard for smaller operations that maybe this is just a secondary, little beef herd or something like that. And I'm not sure if that number is really capturing all of those because there's a lot of those kind of small operations in my area. And then there's like you mentioned, there's a lot of folks that are moving towards not only they have pasture land with next to their cropland that they're planting a cover crop that they're grazing on. I mean, that's becoming incredibly popular in some of my areas that grazing has really caught on, and there's some real good, great groups forming, as I know in kind of your area.
When I
Um,
moved here in 2017, I could not understand why we didn't have fences around all of our crop field and we were terminating all of this stuff, right? It was, now I've got more acclimated and I've understood this moving from a livestock state to a grain state or what we would call kind of intermediate. But I had this huge mental barrier of like, I don't understand. So you're telling me we don't fence these fields, we don't have livestock in here, and we just spray it and kill it? Like it was absolutely mind-boggling and took me years to get around this. And so it has been a dream. It has been a pleasure of mine to see people after years of education that the university and other stakeholders have been doing to see people trying to transition into some of this grazing these cover crops and grazing some of these alternatives.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned just kind of I think there's also the heritage of our state being a dairy state, right? I mean that just when you have a dairy, right, you have one area that you're doing all the milking that you need to keep cows, relatively close to. And you have a lot more manure to handle and deal with, right? So it makes a lot more sense to spray your crop field or spread manure on your crop fields, harvest the crops, right? And so we have a lot of areas of Pennsylvania that have been built on dairy. Maybe a lot of them are beef operations now, but that heritage is still there, right? Where that change is happening, where people are kind of considering, even if they do have dairy. I have a lot of dairy folks that are kind of interested in getting into the pasture raised, milk and things like that. That are looking into this. So it's something that is definitely people are thinking a little bit more about. So Yeah, I think Justin, we probably talked amongst enough amongst ourselves.
Let's
So you
do
think
it.
it's time to introduce our guest?
Yeah, let's do it. So today we've got Dave Hartman, and I started here in 2017, and Dave was one of the folks that I kind of got connected to because of my background with animals and agronomy and working on some papers and stuff. And Dave has since moved on from Extension and is now a project coordinator with the Pennsylvania Grazing Lands Coalition. But uh, Dave, if you want to introduce yourself, we're happy to have you. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing now and what you did in the past, and welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate the invite. Um, I guess I'll start with the past first. A little bit about my background. And I was fortunate enough to grow up in a farming family and got indoctrinated into learning about agriculture pretty early. And my first livestock actually was pigs that I raised for 4-H when I was about 12 or 13 years old. So, but my interest in livestock kind of came about pretty early. And I went ahead and went on to major in animal production at Penn State and graduated in '85, and then started the same year working for Penn State Extension out of Carlisle for a couple of years in Cumberland County in a fixed term appointment, and then spent 30 years working based at Bloomsburg, and eventually got my master's degree in forage agronomy. So if you have a background in livestock and a interest in agronomy as well, sort of the intersection of those two things is grazing and forage crops and that sort of thing. So, and I found a lot of interest out there as I watched people go through various phases. I guess the industry went through various phases where we had people interested in getting getting into livestock grazing and establishing rotational grazing and that sort of thing. And then we saw that segue into interest in grass finishing cattle or lambs. And then we saw more people wanting to do direct marketing. And then things segued into, as the fellows were mentioning here a little while ago, incorporating livestock grazing into cropping systems using cover crops and that sort of thing. As well as people interested in high density grazing and that sort of stuff. So I've seen things change a lot over the years and sort of progress along, and it's been really interesting. So anyways, after 38 years with Penn State, then I retired last year, and but was still interested in doing some things, preferably in the livestock grazing arena, and then a part-time position came along. In my personal life, I do operate a small grazing operation. I have Katahdin ewes and some Angus beef cows. And we operate under my LLC name is Watson Hartman LLC. And it's sort of a one-man show, basically. You do a little bit of direct marketing, sell a little bit of breeding stock. And but it's a heck of a way to learn a lot of things, is to kind of get your hands into it and try to be making those decisions that everybody else struggles with too. So that's a little bit about my background. So the current work that I'm involved with the Grazing Coalition is a 2-year project, a grant funded situation where we're actually doing some work with mentorship program where we try to pair up people with experience with those that are looking to get some experience and fund that sort of thing. We're doing some demonstration work with temporary fencing and looking to get into doing some virtual fence work next year. We were hoping to have that going here this year, but ran into some problems there. And so hopefully next year we'll be having some demonstrations, a couple places in the state on virtual fencing. Other than that, we're doing some work we support education efforts through mini grants, which has been a popular feature to have available in Pennsylvania. So a number of different things happening there. We have a volunteer board of folks from around the state representing different ag organizations and different interest areas as far as species of animals and that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, and to your point, Dave, I think the PAGLC has done it. It seems like they have a great presence in the grazing community, and I just think they have a great group of growers focused on this, and you guys kind of have a great thing going with Extension and the coalition. I think it's a great model to help people along the process, because it can be an incredibly complex process to venture into.
Yeah, there's a lot of things happening right now. So we're actually part of the parent organization is the National Grazing Land Coalition, and any state that wants to have a grazing land coalition can establish one. I think there's 19 different states that have one at this point, and Pennsylvania is we're fortunate enough to have an active GLC in this state. So it's been a good thing. Mentoring is one of those things that's kind of, as I think you're alluding to, Ryan, it's kind of come of age. And, if you're a person coming into this kind of stuff totally inexperienced, there's so much information out there that you can get confused in a big hurry, or maybe get, kind of running down the wrong track. And I'm more of in favor of starting out with really basic management practices, and don't try to run before you can walk. So I'd rather see people get started slowly and segue into things. And having a mentor there that you can touch base with once a week and just ask them questions is really, really huge for a lot of people. So it's been an important program to get going. And
Sure.
other organizations are offering that concept as well. So it's time has come.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I see that. I do a lot of work in organics as well. And I think Rodale does a great job of that, mentoring with helping people through the organic process. And I think, like you kind of mentioned there, that we're in a world where there's so much information available, and we offer a lot of information out there, and it can be hard to know where to start. And that's really where that relationship can really help. So
Yeah.
maybe with that, maybe you can kind of mentor us here on how to properly winter feed, and how to manage your pasture, your feeding and your pastures in the winter. So let's start with the basics here then. And can you just basically, when we're talking about this concept of winter feeding, what do we have to be aware of? What are the damages that can happen to your pasture in this time period? What are our options for feeding? What are we really talking about when we're talking about winter feeding, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I'll start back a little bit further back with what you guys were talking about earlier. And in Pennsylvania, a lot of times, if you look around at farms that have either active pasture or even abandoned pasture or stuff that's reverted back to brush and that sort of thing, most farms at one time had some pasture, but it was relegated to the poorest land on the farm, which is fine. As the concept goes, that makes sense. It was land that was either too steep, too shallow, too droughty to farm, or maybe even low-lying land that might have been too wet to try to farm. And so people used the poorest soils on the farm. But we can make use of any of those kind of situations by bringing livestock into the picture and establishing a grazing program. One of the problems I've seen really is that more people haven't wanted to manage that situation. Okay. They've wanted to just, again, you kind of treated the pasture like the poor stepchild, and all the attention went to the land that was being put into corn or wheat or whatever crops you're grazing, that everybody thinks take more management, and they take a lot of management. We can make pasture into a management intensive situation as well, especially with the fencing materials that we have these days, and more knowledge on how to manage things. So as far as your question, I was thinking about this earlier. There's actually two different pieces, and I wanted to point out, first of all, before I forget, I know this is an agronomic study or an agronomic discussion here. But when we're talking about winter feeding or outfeeding, outwintering livestock, we do need to be cognizant of any kind of welfare issues, okay, with our livestock. So what I've always told people over the years, basically the worst situation we can be in for our livestock would actually be weather situations where the temperature might be in the 30s and it's raining hard and it's windy. Okay. And what happens is, if we've got rain, even though the animal has a winter coat, hopefully by that point, that coat gets wet, gets saturated, and then it loses its insulation ability. And then if we have wind chill on top of that, it can be a really stressful situation. So I think most of the scientific information that's out there indicates that if we can just cut the wind chill, even just a windbreak, can go a long ways towards remedying that situation and making it manageable. So, but I would ask people to be cognizant of that if you're going to try any kind of outwintering. And there are charts available through different universities where you can, look at the temperature and the wind speed and things like that, and have some assessment on the amount of stress that's on the livestock. So be thinking about that if you're going to try to seriously do much with outdoor feeding.
So this seems like a good place to jump in and kind of reiterate our veterinary disclaimer of Ryan and Justin and Dave are not veterinarians. What we are educators. And what we're doing is we're kind of talking about these animal symptoms and signs for educational purposes, right? Like we're trying to help guide you to where you can find resources and the things to do. But please, if you see problems with your animals, call your veterinarian. Do not call us, because we're going to advise you to call your veterinarian. So let's cut out the middle person. But Dave, I want to say I looked back, and like you mentioned on those tables, it is so dramatically connected to the wind, right?
Yeah.
We can look at. I'm going to put one in the show notes. It's actually an article. It's a table that comes out of Iowa. But as we look at these temperatures, with a calm day, we consider this little to no damage, like almost down to -20, right? It's amazing what we can do. Now, even at like something of 20 degrees with a wind chill, we can kind of push ourselves into that susceptible range if we've got wet and wind at 15 degrees. So it
Yeah.
just kind of reiterates what you're saying in this really nice kind of colorized graph that we'll throw in there for people to kind of click on and look. The other thing I wanted to kind of throw out there was there are symptoms, right? Like they're just like us, right? And if we're having a hard time relating to this, put your coat on, walk outside, come back in, put your coat in the bathtub, and then put it on your body and walk outside, right? It's a very different situation. But when you see these animals shivering, huddling, not wanting to eat, not wanting to do that stuff, right? Like again, they're mammals just the same as we are, and there are very clear signs as to what we should be looking for.
Yeah. Yep. And it all comes down to management and being, thinking about this stuff. Our cattle, sheep, they have a tremendous capacity to be able to tolerate tough conditions. You take a cow, she's got a 30-gallon fermentation vat in her side, so she's generating an awful lot of heat, and so they can be perfectly comfortable in what we would call extremely cold conditions. But wind speed combined with a wet coat is an issue, but the windbreak is important. And I have a picture on my computer of a windbreak out in South Dakota that I took a picture of a few years ago. And that, was one of those situations where you can fairly flat terrain. You can see to the north and the west for miles and miles and miles. And it's just right out there on the range is just a windbreak, a permanent structure that they would, the cattle get behind that. They feed them hay there, and things are generally pretty good that way. So, yeah. So anyways, I would just ask people to just make sure we think about that. Back to the agronomic piece of this, this whole discussion kind of reminded me of an old saying that I heard a number of times over the years, that the best thing that a person can put on their land is their own shadow. Okay. So, as agronomists, we might be wanting people to look at a soil test report or do this or do that and put this on and put that on. But if you're not out there doing some observation in some way, shape, or form, in this situation with wintering livestock and understand what could happen to your soil, you need to be observant and understand it and get out there and look and put your own shadow out there. First part of that really is to have a good understanding of what the soils are like on your farm. And most people do, but if you're in a situation where you just bought a farm or bought some land, you want to learn more about those soils and not only get out there on foot, but also take a look at the soil survey for that farm. And so if you haven't ever looked at the USDA soil surveys, every acre has been cataloged basically in the country, and there's old hard copy books around that you might be able to find a copy of that. But you can go into the web under the web soil survey or USDA web soil survey and quickly hone in on your piece of land and have a pretty good understanding of the soils just from looking at that. And then further information about the soil types, you know, what the drainage characteristics are, you know, that sort of thing. So we're talking wintering livestock and putting pressure on land. Drainage characteristics are really, really important. And there's a huge difference out there. I don't, at my farm, actively outwinter cattle very much unless we have that free concrete that the fellows were talking about here earlier. But last winter, we only froze up for about a week or 10 days, and that was our free concrete, and all of a sudden it was gone. And so if I have that firm footing, I might tend to let cattle out for indefinitely for the whole winter if they want to be, but have access back to the buildings. But if it is like it was much of last winter, on a lot of the soil that I have available close to my buildings, they can do a lot of damage in a hurry. It's high clay content. And, you know, every farm is different. And on that particular property, the best land to outwinter is actually removed by some good distance from the buildings. And so there's, you know, some that's really, really excessively well-drained shale that would be great to winter livestock on, but it's a distance away from the buildings and from the frost-free water source and that sort of thing. So understanding the soils is your first step. Okay, look at the soil surveys, whether it's on the web or in the book form, and figure that out, and then get out and walk around, because you'll find as well that sometimes as you gain more experience with your land and your soils, you'll find that sometimes the maps aren't exactly right. You know, you may find that there's idiosyncrasies, and they may have some of the soil mapped in a certain way, but there may be some small pockets of other types of soils in there that may not be as well drained. So
what you know, I want to jump in here. I've got web soil survey pulled up, and this is, if you've never gotten in there, this can be a very overwhelming, very robust set of data, because there are all of these options and all of these things. But if you look at like this, we're going to put a link to this in the show note. But what I would encourage is this like hydrologic erosion rating, right? And so what we're kind of looking at is this drainage class, this runoff class. Those are the kind of things that we're wanting to focus in on, right? You can kind of look at these soil susceptibility ratings, and there's actually some for a lot of different things. Like they have a manure waste process, right? And if you have any limitations to that, that could be something to look at. In agriculture, they talk about nitrate leaching potential. That's probably a pretty good one to look at, because we can talk about how the urine and the nitrates and all of that stuff will move through that soil. The other part of that is, so you key into this and you look at your farm, there are going to be good spots and bad spots. And I also advise, like, and Dave, you could probably relate to this on your property. I would almost guarantee the best spot is the furthest spot away from your home. Almost 95% of the time, right? That is the hardest spot to get to. And so you have to kind of find this moderate, nice balance of where you can keep them that makes sense to the water. It makes sense to your feed stuff, your food stuffs where you're storing that. It makes sense to, if we do have all this mud and muck or snow or ice, can you safely get to the animals? Can you be monitoring them reasonably, right? So this isn't just, I don't want you to get on here, find the best soils you have, and say, I'm going to dump my cows or my sheep or something up here on the back of the mountain, and I'll check on them next week, because that's a big part of this too, right?
yeah, there's no one size fits all for this. There's no cookie cutter approach or recipe. You kind of got to figure out some of the stuff based on your own resources. you know, your livestock, your land, your water source, your time that you have, all sorts of things. And I've seen people approach this in different ways, okay, as far as what do we do if we're going to feed out on the land quite a bit. And some will incorporate it into like a whole farm approach. Okay, so they're actively moving livestock on a regular basis. That might be to utilize maybe some forages that are stockpiled and still left from the growing season. Or that might be for this new term that we've been hearing more called bale grazing. All these things take management. Okay, the stockpiling, of course, that's a whole different discussion that you could spend another podcast on. Bale grazing is also another one that you could spend a whole podcast on. But these things all need to be managed, okay? And I'm still coming from the old days where we basically didn't recommend putting bales out and grazing them without at least a ring around them or sticking them into some kind of a feeder to try to reduce the amount of wastage. But the thinking is changing on that a little bit, and again, but with doing that, if we do that kind of an approach, we're out there, we need to be thinking about how that interacts with our soils, and can our soils tolerate that, especially if the conditions are such that the soil is not frozen up. If it's frozen, things can work a heck of a lot easier, but we can't count on that necessarily. So we need to be thinking about how else we can manage it. Moving animals ahead, and you know, how would I say it? Not allowing animals to traffic any given area for a long period of time can go a long ways towards towards avoiding a lot of damage to the soil to begin with. So that's another challenge. You know, maybe you're just going to take 5 acres or 10 acres and sort of use it as a sacrifice area. And people do that and they feed everything there all winter. There's some different risks with that, some different potential problems, you know, compaction, damage to the soil, the divots that come from hoof pressure of cattle, especially runoff, like Justin was mentioning earlier, that has to do with the slope of the land or maybe the leaching potential. Nutrient buildup obviously is a big one with something like that. So if you can situate it such, if you're going to do that, to maybe move that wintering area to a different place next year, in a different place the following year, and that might be possible on some farms, but maybe not others. If you've got to keep it in the same area, one thing that could be done is to avoid buildup. Maybe take that sacrificed area, establish it to an annual crop during the grazing season, and then mow that off, bale it, and feed that somewhere else to sort of remove those nutrients and take them somewhere else to be utilized, rather than continuing to build up nutrients on those same acres that you're out wintering on. So this is all soil testing.
That's one of my favorite topics to talk about, right? Is this deposition of nutrients right outside of our barns,
Yep.
or picking the same lot, and this kind of habitual usage there, and
Yep.
that like spatial movement, right? So we could spend 3 hours on that podcast. We might have to do a mini series on nutrient deposition around livestock feeding. And like, so where I think is the most, and I want to go back to something that you mentioned there. You said you don't often let your beef cattle out unless you have free concrete. What do you do with them if you don't have that?
I'm again, every farm's different and every set of resources is a little bit different. So I've got a situation where I have a 3-sided windbreak, okay, that faces to the southeast. And then there's a concrete apron there that in a prior life was a hog barn, okay, which was taken down, decommissioned, manure system closed up, all that type of thing was done. And then I was left with a big concrete pad. So so I'll let the cattle there where they've got some firm footing, that gets cleaned off periodically, and then the manure stacked inside of a plastic building under a roof. And so it works. But again, if the ground is frozen, I'd rather see him out and have a little bit more access to just walk around, get more exercise. But with the small number of cattle I have, the concrete pad that I have actually works pretty good. And, for most of the winter, if I need to use it that way.
So you mentioned here that you don't necessarily you want to get them moving as much as possible. So maybe you can highlight here, like when would you make that decision to get them in a barn versus a pad versus, put them out on the field? Like, do you have any standards where you say, okay, today's a good day for me to go and let my cattle be outdoors. Actually, today I'm going to go to take them onto this concrete pad or in the barn.
In my situation, Ryan?
In your situation or someone else's situation as well. Maybe we can generalize here. All of the kind of different structures that and what their versus
You're
Justin
in
looks
your
like.
mental
Yeah.
mode
In,
from PAGLC and your mentee calls and says, "What should I do with my cows today?" How would you advise them on making those decisions?
well, yeah, I'll say about in my situation first. If I let cattle out for long onto fields that are close to the buildings and the land isn't frozen, it's almost guaranteed to be too wet to be on. Okay. And I have a 5-acre field right now that's close to the buildings that the cattle spent too much time on it last winter when it wasn't frozen. And honestly, it needs to be killed and chisel plowed, worked up, leveled back out, and reestablished back into pasture. And all that kind of work is time consuming and expensive to do. And so, but that's kind of the problem that I have that I created through my own management. It was just an extended winter, with really no frozen ground. And that was so difficult. So for other people's situation, boy, it is tough. It's based again on what your alternatives are. Okay. What your schedule is like. A lot of people with these small beef herds we have in Pennsylvania work somewhere else. Okay. And so they're not at the farm all the time. And so decisions need to be made, ahead of time so they can work it in what they're going to do with their work schedule. So if it's a function of the soil types really and those weather conditions. So if you've got pretty well drained land around where all your buildings are at, it can tolerate quite a bit of rainfall without doing a whole lot of damage. I know some farmers that have that situation and they do outwinter cattle for a whole winter on well-drained land and then come back in the springtime, maybe just lightly disc it, that area, and then establish it to a summer annual or a spring annual first, maybe a combination with oats and some things like that. And then maybe graze that off and then bring a summer annual into that, for grazing season. So I don't know if that's really answering your question. The other thing we have to be concerned with, if your livestock barn is not quite big enough to handle the number of cattle or sheep or whatever you have, the last thing you want to do is go in there and lock the door behind them and have them in the barn for an extended period of time during the wintertime and mild weather when they really need to be out where they can have better air. A lot of our old barns are closed up too tight. There's not enough air exchange. Earlier last summer, I guess it was, I was talking to a friend of mine we were talking about a fellow we knew who was a veterinarian, and he said that when he came to the area years ago, the first thing he wanted to do was get all the farmers he knew crowbars so they could open up all the doors they had nailed shut on their barns to keep the cattle in for the winter. And there's so much truth in that. Again, it goes back to cattle can tolerate, and sheep and whatever can tolerate a lot colder conditions than we can. We don't need to lock them in the barn for the winter. So if you're in a situation where they're in there and you're going to put them in the barn and it's pretty tight and there's not quite enough air exchange, you might be asking for more problems than you bargained for in terms of respiratory health of the livestock. So it's better to maybe in that situation designate a sacrifice area, maybe just a few acres where you can safely do that, area that's away from a stream an area that's not close to any well heads where you're drawing water out of a well, springs, that sort of thing. And just use that as kind of the outdoor sacrifice with access to the barn. Okay. That would be probably a good way to approach it. So
I'm going to jump in here a little bit, Dave, and
yep, go ahead.
I'm going to hope that you can tell me when I'm wrong or when I'm right, and this will encourage some conversation. So, I think the indoor thing is one of these, you either have it or you don't, right? Like very few of the producers that I work with from a livestock setting ever want to consider total confinement, right? Because there's animal health aspects to that. There's getting feed in there. Our days of confining all of our animals all the time, unless we're in this particular confinement setting, right? Like, I'm often don't want to think about us confining mama cows with calves and stuff and locking them in these barns. Right now, if we've worked through a contract with an NRCS or something like that and we've sized them appropriately, there's some caveats, right? There's always an asterisk, but generally speaking, my advice to most people is when we start thinking about sacrifice areas is, go back to this soil survey, think about what makes sense. But just like we talked about with this nutrient deposition, is we have to be able to kind of clean this up. We're feeding a bunch of hay, right? All of this hay that we're buying the fertilizer for, doing something with, is kind of going in this area. And if it's not something that's shallow, or excuse me, flat enough, that we can get equipment on to either reseed, to pull that back out, or even get on there to clean it up, to drag it enough to broadcast, then we've created a really big mess. And
Yep.
so we have to think about this next year or the year after. And what we're going to do is, it's going to be temporary and we're going to rotate it. Well, then we have to have 2 or 3 of those areas. Is it going to be one that we can say, okay, well, we're going to winter them in here, and then after we pull them out, we're going to clean it up and maybe put something like sorghum sudan or something that's going to pull a bunch of those nutrients out of it, and we beat it up again next winter. All of those things are very important that we have to think about. The last one that I don't know as much about, and I think you may be able to help us with, is pads.
Yeah.
Now I know there's the concrete pad option, there's earthen pad options where you go down to, you hit that clay. What I know about this is that we have to be careful with how much land we disturb, because that can change us, and we need to talk to potentially our conservation districts about some of the legality and the permitting and stuff that occurs within that area. So could you talk to us a little bit more about whether a concrete pad would be better, looking at an earthen pad, gravel, geotextiles? Is there any information about something like that, and if that would be better for a lot of our situations?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Justin. I was going to bring that in if you didn't. That's the next step. Okay, so if you can't safely outwinter in an environmentally responsible fashion, and there's these potential issues, talk to the people in conservation, NRCS, USDA, NRCS, your local county conservation district, and they're there to help you. And you can take cost sharing maybe for projects, or you don't have to, but tap the expertise that's available. And they can come in, look the situation over. If you're kind of up against between a rock and a hard place, basically, as to outwintering cattle or any livestock. I keep saying cattle, but mainly that's what we see. And cattle can cause an awful lot of damage in a hurry in an unmanaged scenario. But they can look at all these factors and say, okay, you probably really ought to, look at doing a heavy use area pad type of thing. Like Justin's talking about, ones that are earthen or ones that are concrete. I'm no expert on those. I've always referred to the conservation experts that come into that. There's engineers on staff in those agencies that can design that type of thing. Most of the ones I have seen on farms in Pennsylvania were actually constructed from concrete, and may even involve a situation where the manure that lands on there, basically, or is deposited on that concrete pad, eventually ends up into a storage area, where it can be, safely put under a roof until the time that it can be taken out and applied to land back onto the land in the springtime. So, but they can sit down and take a look at all the factors involved on your piece of ground and say, here's what we should do, here's what we would recommend you do. And, we can help design it for you, or in some situations, and at least in my counties, and I'm sure a lot of other counties in Pennsylvania, I've seen small buildings, which, have been constructed as well in some of these situations to just try to help the producer have a better option, basically, to winter cattle, get them in under a roof more of the time, and be able to capture the nutrients and manage those.
And I do think, right, as we talk about this is a hard one to generalize for something like this, because Dave's past and maybe what he's doing now, or myself or Ryan, we get calls from people that have 50 cows, 75 cows, 5 cows, and all of this is, I tell everybody, my favorite thing to say in extension is it depends, right? And everybody wants the answer, or they want this guidance. My recommendation for 5 cows is dramatically different than my recommendation for 35 or 75 cows, right? Like it's a sliding scale, but things don't always translate in this 1-to-1. And then again, it comes back to this: what equipment do you have options to? Sometimes, and a lot of times, feeding out as best we can in as many situations as we can really is going to help us reduce some of the equipment needs we have, as long as we're doing that conservatively, right? If we don't have the tractor to spread the manure or scrape the pad, or those kind of things, right? And so this is a great primer to start this thinking in your head as we're moving into January, of what am I doing now, and what is this going to do to my operation in March, right? It's probably a little late now for us to make too many dramatic changes on your operation. What we're trying to do is get you thinking about changes that maybe could happen in 2025 to make the winter of 25-26 more applicable and better for what you're thinking about.
Yeah, that's important. I was going to mention that too. This isn't something that we just decide on a whim. We need to be thinking about this a good ways ahead of time, the sooner the better, and have a plan in place as to how we're going to manage these scenarios. And something that occurred to me too here while we were talking is just, we talk about the nutrients, and of course not wanting the nutrients to get into a situation where they're becoming an environmental hazard, but also just the value of the nutrients. I forget what the value of the fertility in a hay bale is right now. I just saw that figure somewhere not too long ago, but it's significant. And anything we can do to keep nutrients where we need them, or be able to capture them back out of a heavy use area, pull them back out with a forage crop and take them somewhere else, could pay, okay? Because we need to be thinking about the value of the nutrients, not just manure being a problem or a liability. It needs to be looked at as a resource that has value.
So my last valuation of that, based on spring of 24 fertilizer prices, so the removal rate's 50 pounds of nitrogen, 15 pounds of phosphorus, 50 pounds of potassium. When we evaluate that based on urea, monoammonium phosphate, and potash, that's roughly 75 pounds a ton of just pure fertilizer value is what we're feeding. And Dave, you're going to have a much better idea of how much goes in, but when we start thinking about outdoor feeding, or some of these bale placements, and 30 to 40% waste, and how that number gets extrapolated, it's amazing of how much of that nutrient is going in there. We just had a meeting, or a podcast last 2 weeks ago with Rob Minen about the winter manure spreading, right? And the value and the importance of getting that to the right place and at the right time, and capturing all of these nutrients. And so as farming becomes more cost prohibitive every year, this is something we have to be taking more and more seriously every year, is how much the value of this stuff truly is.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, everybody's situation is different. So let's say, we're going to outwinter cattle and have a bale grazing system. Part of that strategy is what we're doing is, yeah, we're wasting a little more hay there, but those nutrients stay out there on a field in a pasture where we would like to have them. Manure is deposited there, and if we have a good system where we can move that around the farm and take out graze those bales that are placed out across the property, we've distributed manure out as well. And not only is it not concentrated in any one area, but it's distributed. We didn't have to scrape it up and haul it, and it's there right away for use in that crop as soon as the growing season gets started next spring.
So Dave, I have a question here. So we're also looking towards maybe the growing season. Are there things that we should think about in kind of preparing for, like, we're kind of getting in this conversation about this is almost part of your crop rotation, right? If we can manage it as such and really think about how can we feed cattle outdoors in the right areas that get their nutrients in the right place, and maybe be able to move them into other places those nutrients are going to be valuable, right? And move them as much as they can to not disturb land, right? It's this juggling act, right? Are there things that we should be thinking about going into the next growing season of preparing our land and preparing certain areas for winter feeding? And is there kind of, I guess, even looking towards next winter, are you looking at your pastures a little bit differently and saying, I won't harvest that field if it's in hay for the last time because I want to winter cattle there in the messy part of the year. And maybe that's better. Maybe it's not. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a whole mindset change or a paradigm shift or whatever you want to call it. And I was thinking about that earlier. Something I did want to mention was I about 20 years ago, I had the good fortune to be involved with a big grant project that was between one of our cattle specialists at Penn State and a researcher in Argentina. And our goal with the whole project was we wanted to learn more about grass finishing cattle. And that's a big part of what they've done in that country. And they have the research base. And for the most part, they were using the same forage crops that we have available to us here in Pennsylvania. So this was a 3-year project. And as part of that, we got to go, 4 of us went to Argentina for a week and spent 5 days there in the Pampas region, visiting cattle production operations and cropping operations. And one of the big takeaways for me from that whole thing was, just driving through that region, which was vast, and we just saw thousands and thousands and thousands of cattle on cover crop oats, for example. And the more we talked to these guys that were managing these operations, a lot of them were professional management that were hired by landholding families. And so these guys, everything was dollars and cents. And they just looked at cattle as another crop in the rotation. Okay, so yeah, we're growing corn, we're growing soybeans, we're growing wheat. They may have had some other crops in some situations, but cattle are also part of that scenario, and they're looked upon as another crop in the rotation. And so it showed me what could be done with a strategy of using cover crops to stretch a grazing season, and or using hay fields at the end of the season. They may have taken a cutting, or they may have grazed a hay field all summer and not used it for hay. And then that field is taken out. It was orchard grass and alfalfa. That field would be taken out and produce a 200 bushel per acre corn crop the following season without any additional nitrogen being applied to it. So it's a strategy. It takes a lot of planning and thinking and mapping it out and figuring out what you want to do. If you're going to be serious about cover crops for grazing, one of the problems we have here is you can't just go in after corn that was harvested November 1st and plant rye and expect it to really contribute much to your grazing program for the winter. It just isn't going to happen. It just doesn't have enough time to establish. So if you're wanting to bring grazing into the cropping system and have some serious forage there, one of the conclusions I've come to is that we're really looking at having to have some small grains in the rotation that come off during the middle of the summer And then when the temperatures moderate, maybe later in August, we get in there and we plant a strong forage crop, maybe in mid to late August, for example, that would involve maybe a mixture of different things, but oats has always been a good, reliable, inexpensive forage crop that can be planted that time of year. Triticale, rye, brassica crops, turnips, that sort of thing. There's a number of different options, and probably a diverse mixture would be great. So, but if we're planting that in November, it's not going to do much for us. So my point is that having some capacity set aside, land availability set aside to be able to get a crop in there in late summer is ideal. And if we manage that out, then to graze and strip graze it out during the wintertime, that could add a lot of mileage to the grazing season. And again, you're back to that situation where the manure is being distributed. We can, don't have to haul manure in that situation. It's already been spread out there. The nutrients are there and captured. So, but it's something that takes a lot of planning, and we don't just decide that we're going to do it and just throw it together. It just needs to be thought through, and you have to have a strategy and a plan to make something like that work.
So, Dave, I think that's a great caveat to one of the things we talked about earlier was thinking maybe like February, March, revisiting a podcast idea on spring seedings, how we clean up some of this, I don't want to call it mess, but some of this damage. What's the best opportunities for that? Some of these mixes or things that we could look at in the spring. Maybe this sets us up for thinking about something along the lines of like July, August, and thinking about that fall mix and that stockpile, because it's something we need to really, again, be thinking about seriously with the drought conditions and changing away from not always just using cool seasons and diversifying some of our species to help get us through not only the summer, but also the winter with our feeding operations.
Right. Yep.
So, Dave, we thank you for all the information and the time. PAGLC, do you all have any events or meetings coming up anytime in Pennsylvania, first of the year, that we should be aware of?
We don't do that many events that we actually sponsor or that we actually run. We did do one recently in Greensburg, which was a bale grazing and wintering livestock type of an event there in the middle of November. Our role has been more towards helping to support existing events and conferences. So again, back to our mini grant program has helped to fund events like the Western PA Grazing Conference, for example, the Franklin Grazers Conference, which takes place in January. So we're more in a support role. We do try to get as many events as we can on our website calendar.
Okay.
There's an event calendar, so as we hear of events, we'll make an effort to get those listed. So if you have an event coming up in your county that we may not know about, just email me the details, and we can try to get that into the calendar. So there's always plenty of different things coming down the pike. Next week is the Mid-Atlantic Grazing Conference at Hagerstown, Maryland. And so that's also this year involving a combined meeting with the Northeast Pasture Consortium. They're having their annual meeting there as well in conjunction with that event.
So any final thoughts, Ryan or Dave?
No, I've been here learning a lot. I don't often think about the livestock side as much as I should. I've been quiet today, but it's because I'm
sharpening your pencil from all the notes you're taking, right?
Yeah, I have a full page right here.
Well,
and a lot of question marks.
I go back to the thing that I probably said 10 times already: is every farm's different and the resources are different and everybody's situation's different. So it can be confusing, but getting out there and talking to different producers that have experience, talking to extension folks, talking to the conservation offices, getting input from as many people as you can to figure out what you need to do. There's always a way to manage things. It sometimes may not be what we want to hear, but to do things correctly, it's good to get as much input as we can before we go down any given road. And so
Yeah, definitely. And we layer on the fact that every farm's different, every herd is different, every soil type's different, then just the conditions that we face every year are just so variable. So, yeah, finding those people in your local community that can help you with that process, help you with those decisions is definitely very valuable. All right. Well,
yeah.
Dave, thank you again for coming on. And for our listeners, we hope you enjoyed that episode, and we'll see you on another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast.